We're delighted at Schools That Can to welcome you to our extraordinary conversation today between John King, David Steiner, and Norman Atkins. These legendary education leaders need no introduction, but a few words about the topic that we'll be discussing. Our theme for this conversation is, where do we go from here with education reform? This is an urgent topic. The pandemic has caused havoc, and I can't remember hearing anyone in the last 3 years talking about education reform. And yet, with all the challenges we face in public education, the need for planning for the future has never been more important. Today, we'll be hearing from three wise friends in conversation about current needs and how they may translate that into education reform. We thank them for sharing their insights at a time when I am sure our audience is eager to benefit from their wisdom. This session does not have a moderator, but will take a congenial conversation approach, like a fireside chat between friends. I will pose an opening question to Secretary King. John, the 2022 NAEP results attest to the considerable damage COVID did to K-8 educational outcomes, especially in regard to underprivileged children. What should state and district education policymakers be doing in response?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And look, I would say first we have to acknowledge that the NAEP results are showing us how COVID exacerbated challenges that existed before COVID. Low-income students and students of color already experienced tremendous opportunity gaps, and those were exacerbated by the COVID crisis. And it wasn't just the disruption of school, it was a disruption of kids' lives, the loss of family members, loss of homes, loss of jobs. So now the question is, how will districts leverage the huge resources that they've gotten from the federal government to hopefully address unfinished learning, but more than that, make the changes that will lead to a more equitable future going forward? You know, there are some very concrete things districts could be doing. We have a great evidence base around the power of high dosage tutoring, intensive tutoring, well-trained tutor using high quality materials, working intensively with students one-on-one or in small groups. Districts should be investing there. Districts could be investing in expanded learning time, longer school year, summer programs, but they have to be high quality and they have to be high engagement, because the evidence on summer programs is they only work if the kids come. And so you got to make sure that that you've got, as I like to say, ice cream with the broccoli, things that motivate kids to come be there so that then they can get exposure to the academic material as well. Things like robotics and arts and athletics and so forth. School districts could be putting resources towards improving core instruction. We know a tremendous amount about the science of reading that isn't reflected in many of the curricula that we use and in much of the training that teachers experience. We can invest resources there to make core instruction stronger. My worry is a lot of money is being spent. There's not a real requirement for transparency or accountability around how those dollars are used. And to my mind, not enough reflection on how we use this moment to transform the school experiences that kids have.
Norman, your thoughts on this? Thanks, John.
Oh no, I'm pretty much in agreement with what John shared. I wonder what's going to happen. So two things. One is there a way to spread the money out past the next 18 months? Because if we can't get it past September 2024, I'm not confident that schools will spend it, or districts will spend it, or spend it well. And I'm terrified that after the money goes away, the beautiful agenda that John just shared, which I agree with, won't have the resources to bring it forward beyond 2024.
Yeah, I mean, we know from 2009, when it was $50 billion in aid through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that when that cliff came, there were really severe cuts. Teachers were let go. Some schools were shut down. Only Tennessee, to the best of my knowledge, has really done thoughtful planning around this, with the state guaranteeing about $1 billion of new investment around the strategies that John was talking about. That is, really well-defined tutoring. They talk about dosage, they talk about the absolute training of those doing the tutoring, again, on the same with the summer programs. So Tennessee has done some thinking about this, but it doesn't seem that most states have. The other more general point I would make is that the evidence from Brookings recently, which I find very disturbing, is that 90% of American school children's parents, and this is from late August of this year, think the kids are doing well academically, just fine, 90%. And even when you look at those who are not, who are getting C's or below in school, only about a third of the parents are even willing to think about summer school, for example. And so this sort of sense of self-satisfaction is mitigating against the interventions, right? Not just whether the children are going, but putting support behind doing that long-term investing that would avoid the cliff. I don't know if you have thoughts of that, John, but I found that statistic really quite striking.
It's really worrying, and I think it reflects in part a lack of transparency about outcomes with parents.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the things that get sent home to parents are hard to read. They're not designed to be generally accessible. You know, things like percentile and whatnot that don't necessarily immediately make sense to people in terms of their kids' experience. We've seen, you know, states over the last few years either not do state tests or lower the bar for state tests, muddy how they describe state tests. So if you're a parent and the question is my child proficient in reading and math? You probably aren't going to get that answer from the state. You're probably not going to get that answer just from looking at grades, because everyone's getting grades that aren't really reflecting where they are relative to grade level. And so that is a huge problem. And that, to me, that is on all of us as a sector to say we've got to do a lot more truth telling with parents.
Norm, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think parents have lost a lot of trust in schools over the past couple of years during the pandemic, and probably have seen more of what happens inside of education than they had previously, because they were looking over their kids' shoulders into Zoom and witnessed a whole range of behaviors. And so I think maybe parents are just not expecting schools to really deliver on very much academically. And I'm concerned that parents are just pulling their kids out of school, like that kids have not come back after the pandemic, and I'm not quite sure where they're going. But it's beyond worrisome. It's a bit of a mystery, and I think that there is a looming accountability crisis, because I think sort of the combination of letting go of testing during the pandemic and then coming back to really poor results. I think there's a kind of a general feeling that maybe assessments are the least of it to operate schools and just get back to normal. And so there'll be less and less accountability. And even if there's no like teeth to the accountability, just getting the information from what the assessments are telling us are vital to planning and doing better.
Right. I mean, we're down to 11 states that have tests for high school graduation, right? It was 26 a while back. And even in those 11, as you know, there are all sorts of routes around it, right? So over a third of the kids in Baltimore City, from where I'm speaking, graduate thanks to something called the Bridge Project. They failed the state tests. They do this little project in school. And as a member of the state board, I asked for data on fail rates, and there wasn't any, right? So 1/3 of the kids in this city are graduating with no standards whatsoever. So the lack of testing is getting worse. And it happens all the way through the system, right? So we're seeing now the retreat from SAT, ACT, which is a very complicated question, right? It cuts in many directions, both in terms of its impact on underprivileged children and those who are not so. But there is clearly a general movement to shoot the messenger, right? Or to use another analogy, right? Throw away the thermometer and the patient will be well, right? It's just seems very sophomoric at a national level. I wonder whether, we seem to have lost teacher accountability first, now student accountability. What can happen to change this? I mean, where do you see any counter pressure to bring this back? I know, John, in Education Trust, you've been worrying about this for some time.
Yeah. Look, I do think there is still within the civil rights community and within the business community a sense of urgency about addressing the opportunity gaps and a commitment to measurement and to transparency. And one of my frustrations in recent years is you'll have people who say, well, I don't think the existing accountability systems are enough. I want alternative measures. But then when you say, well, tell me about those alternatives, then you don't get a specific answer. I'd love to know, for every high school, how are their graduates doing in college? Are they placed in remedial courses? Are they taking credit-bearing courses? Are they staying in college just for the first semester? Or are they persisting? Do they eventually graduate? Are they majoring in the STEM subjects? Let's be transparent about that. Folks don't want to do that. People say, oh, well, we should use career and technical education. It's hard to find a good plumber. Okay, let's look at career and technical education programs and whether or not kids actually graduate from high school with a meaningful career credential. And what you find, back to the Baltimore example, in Baltimore, I think the percentage of kids in CTE programs who graduate with an actual career credential is a percentage in the single digits, right? So I'm open to complementing state tests with other measures, but we have to be transparent about those measures. We have to disaggregate them by race, and then we have to act on the information. And at this moment, we don't seem to have the political will for that.
And I'm picking up on what you just said, John. I know, Norman, you've been spending a lot of time in the last few years thinking about this school to college pipeline, and particularly career and technical as part of that. What are you seeing in terms of national developments in that area? Is it encouraging?
Not in K-12 or in higher education. It's very encouraging that there are people who care a lot about training people up for jobs, who are developing really fast, innovative, accountable programs outside of traditional education. And they lack the resources that you have in K-12 and higher education, but are scrappy and motivated, and finding that people who didn't necessarily do so well in college for a variety of reasons can pick up at the age of 24 and 25 and get trained up for jobs within three or 4 months and double their wages. So I think what we need to do is essentially consider using Pell to pay for non-traditional training programs, so long as those programs do put people from the training and education into real jobs. And I believe that we need, kind of to what John was describing before, we need accountability for both K-12 and higher education on the basis of what you're majoring in, are you completing, and are you completing with a job, and what are your wages? And there's a lot of data coming out of Georgetown in this area. There just needs to be a lot more, and that needs to be incredibly transparent. And ultimately, the generating graduates from our K-12 system to people who can finish an educational program, finish a training program, and get a job is the ultimate accountability. So if you don't like the high school test, at the very least, you should like college completion or gainful employment.
Yeah. I'm struck by the fact that Switzerland, which is often cited, and I know it's of course an utterly different system and culture, but right now 65% of high school students go into career and technical training. The government wants that at 75%, and 20 years later, you can't tell the salaries apart, right, from those who chose that track versus the college track. That is a vast distance away from where we are, right? And it would take something of a revolution in education to reorient us against this idea that somehow everyone should desperately try to get into college. And that's the only successful route. I don't know what it will take to make that transition. I don't know, John, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, look, we have a lot of the infrastructure. When you think about our community college system, it could be a place where folks are prepared for jobs that require a 2-year degree and jobs that require a career credential. But that would mean we need to align the curriculum with what employers need. It would mean we need to embed apprenticeships or internship experiences in those community college experiences. A few places are doing that. A few places are thinking about that. As always, we have sort of pockets of excellence around the country, but we aren't seeing that at scale.
Yeah.
And, you know, we just had the Inflation Reduction Act. We're talking about billions of dollars that will be invested in a green economy. Well, that's not going to pay off if we don't have the workforce for that green economy. We need to train people for offshore wind, for solar, for building resilience. We have the CHIPS Act. You know, you think about Micron is going to open this huge facility in Syracuse, New York, tens of thousands of people potentially hired over time. Will there be the workforce we need for those jobs? Not clear unless we update our systems.
Yeah. I guess, Norman, you don't necessarily see community colleges making that shift very effectively.
I don't. I think they're less accountable than K-12. And I think that we've just been, you know, you look at the, you know, John cited a Baltimore completion rate in the single digits. I think a lot of the community colleges have single digit completion rates over the course of 3 years. And to the extent that we can remake the community college system from a junior varsity academic program to one in which it's specifically designed to prepare people for the jobs in the industries and the fields that are needed, that would be worthwhile. Maybe that is the right infrastructure to repurpose, but we have to completely change the accountability mechanism and how those schools operate.
Yeah, what's frustrating to me is, as John says, one sees little pockets, right? I was in South Carolina, technical high school with major investment from major international companies. It had flight simulators, it had robotics, it had world-class, right, facilities, in articulation agreements with industry and community college. But these are points, right, of examples. We don't seem to be able to leverage them into any national scaling. Let's go back to our K-12 system, if we may, for a moment. One of the issues that has hit the press a lot is this question of teacher shortage and whether the system as such is in trouble. The one data point that I would start with, which seems to be irrefutable, is that in the last 15 years, about 30% fewer students are going into teacher training, right? That we know. Everything else seems very disputed. We have bad national data on teacher numbers. It's a year out of date and it's not good. The estimates out of Brown and other universities vary tremendously. Do we have any real sense of what's going on? I mean, what do you see at Relay, Norm, and then John, a few, you know, as well?
Well, I'd be curious from John on what the national data is, because I'm hungry for the data. I can describe what I'm experiencing anecdotally.
Right, John, your thoughts?
Well, part of the problem is we don't have a required quality national data set on teacher openings. What I see in the studies that I think is pretty consistent is that it's more nuanced than a generic teacher shortage, and that the shortages are more intense in particular geographies, high needs urban schools, high needs rural schools. The shortages are more intense in particular subjects, secondary STEM, special education, bilingual teachers or teachers trained to work with English learners. That there are big differences even state to state. You have some states like Oklahoma where teacher salaries are notoriously low. So you have teachers who are leaving, let's say, the Tulsa school district to go to Texas because the salaries are better in Texas. Now, Texas is not a high-paying blue state, but still the teacher salaries are better than in Oklahoma. So that, unfortunately, we don't have the level of specificity we should. I also worry that we have a real teacher diversity shortage. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. So we ought to be working hard to diversify the teacher workforce. That hasn't really broken through in this teacher shortage conversation. Unfortunately, I don't think our policy environment is well suited to nuance. But this is a place where I think we need a much more nuanced discussion.
Right.
I've been traveling, not just in my bubble in New York or even the Northeast, but around the country. And everywhere I go, I hear of people leaving their jobs in public education broadly. Most especially teachers on the front lines, because I think one, they saw during the pandemic what it was like to work from home, and like many people, they decided they did not want to go back to an office or a physical space. And unfortunately, in education, you actually have to go work in a school building. And so I think teachers are leaving in greater numbers than in other fields where they can basically phone it in or zoom it in. Two, I think that people just were trauma is probably too extreme a word, but they were really flipped out by the last couple of years in every respect, and just decided the job was too hard, especially where you're working in places where you're responsible for transforming students' trajectories. And so I think this next generation is unsurprisingly not coming into the profession. You see that in these programs that are set up for the most idealistic folks from the most selective colleges, they're just choosing other places to go and spend their time. The TFA numbers are way down from where they were 7-8 years ago. Right.
Well, I'll split the difference to some degree. First of all, the academic research on this is conflicting. The research out of Brown suggests that it's all been exaggerated. I'm summarizing, that we're down about 4% on pre-pandemic numbers, but that's the entire, not just teachers, but staff, and including bus drivers and cafeteria help. So that's complicated. And while there is definitely, agreed, geographic variation, there is no real crisis. That's the reading out of Brown. On the other hand, Kansas State researchers point to about 35,000, 36,000 vacancies nationally, and point out that that can be devastating in particular locations, a point you've made. And it does seem that the challenge of finding minority candidates is just as bad as it ever has been, right? Which means terrible. So that's complicated. We do have situations where school districts are hiring new people off the COVID stimulus money for fewer students. There are very, very kind of strange things are going on, for example, in Iowa and Texas, where you have districts which have lost public school public school students, but are hiring more teaching staff. And so in some cases, the vacancy rates that are being recorded are against increased hiring numbers, right? Which makes it very, very misleading. But I think the underlying question goes to something Norm touched on, which is morale, right? We are seeing data that morale's at an old 50-year low, that teachers really, between what they went through with COVID, the culture wars, right, the general attacks, it's not a fun time to be a teacher. And that would be reflected in the lack of folks going into the profession, right, at the teacher prep stage. And so it's a complicated picture that's probably made more so by states using emergency certification, bringing back retired teachers, which they're doing in several states, using the military, which they're also doing, including in Florida. So I wish I could have a simple answer to this question, but it's messy. But the morale issue seems to me to be serious and enduring. I don't know, John, if you're picking up the same signals nationally.
No, I think that's right. It is a result of multiple factors, as you described, some of them easier to overcome than others, right? So the hope would be that some of the disruption that people experience in their lives due to COVID, hopefully that is receding some, and we get to a better place there. This school year, I think in most schools, you know, I have kids, my younger daughter's in Montgomery County Public Schools. It feels like a more normal school year, and I think that will help. That said, there are other trends that are headed maybe in the wrong direction. You know, some of the folks who won school board races around the country last week are running on banned books platforms, on anti-critical race theory platforms, where they're going to try to prevent the teaching of the truth about our history. Folks who are running on hostility to LGBTQ students and families. That's scary, and that's going to hurt general morale. You know, as I think back to my own experience as a teacher, I think what so many draw satisfaction from is making a positive difference in the lives of young people. And we have to do a better job of supporting teachers around that. So, you know, when I talk about why is the science of reading important, it's important because the outcomes will be better for kids. It will also be better for teachers when they are using materials where they see that their kids are making progress and becoming better readers. That's going to make the job more satisfying. So I'd like to see us bet on improving outcomes as also a strategy to improve morale.
Good point. Yeah, Norman.
Yeah, that's probably what, you know, not just to bum everybody out. That's probably where John just went is probably a bright spot. In other words, it feels like after 25, 30 years of like pushing against the science of reading and the government's own National Reading Panel recommendations, that there's now a consensus that we ought to be teaching phonics in the early grades, and that, you know, 20 minutes a day of very precise instruction for kids kindergarten through second grade will get kids reading by third grade, reading fluently and ready to, like, you know, read to learn after they've learned to read. And so if we can move toward high quality instructional materials, every district, every state, I think we probably can have a significant impact. That would be a good bet. We probably need to do the same thing around math instruction, and we know what works in math instruction, and hopefully we won't lower the standards. We won't politicize the standards on math instruction, and then we'll get to high expectations and precise, high quality instructional materials for math as well. Because you know, as bad as the NAEP results are now, they were still pretty bad a couple of years ago. And
Yes.
we need a moonshot. We need to basically look at something that seems ambitious around getting kids to read and getting kids to be able to do math by do algebra 1 by the end of 9th grade. Like these are things that we ought to be able to do, and if we can do it, we're going to see movement on NAEP, and that will then be inspiring to the next generation of people, so that they feel like we can do something in public education.
Yes, I mean, I want to build on this bright spot because we were starting with so much pessimism. I have the privilege of working with the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now 14 states are part of a committed network to push towards the adoption across their states of high quality instructional materials. And if you look at the data from Tennessee, from Louisiana, from Delaware, it's extraordinary. I mean, the movement in the last few years, it's now over 95% in Delaware and Tennessee of the districts who are using high quality materials. It raises a larger question, and look at one more example, Mississippi's investment in strategies around reading, right, which showed up on the NAEP results. I suspect Tennessee's will too. They're doing a great deal of work in this area. I think this raises the question of whether the movement in educational reform in directions the three of us have now been talking about and supporting is really now at the state level. That the feds seem to be AWOL. There doesn't seem to be national education reform of anything to talk about. Is that unfair? And maybe it's not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that there's a simple answer here, but as I look at it, it's really become a state story. John, is that your feeling? Or?
Look, I think the Biden administration came in and felt their charge was get schools back open and get resources to schools to address the impact of COVID on everything from unfinished learning to more mundane but important issues like HVAC improvements to try to improve air quality in school buildings. So they saw their focus, get money out the door. I would have preferred some more guardrails around transparency and evaluation. You know, we should know if kids are in a summer program or an after-school program or a tutoring program, how are they doing at the start? How are they doing at the end? What was the impact? So we could learn. That was a missed opportunity. But I think they are leaving a lot of the leadership on these issues, like high-quality instructional materials, like tackling teacher diversity and teacher supply to the states. Some of that traces back to the Every Student Succeeds Act during the Obama administration, which definitely moved some of the policy prerogative to states. But that means we need states to step up. And I think there are some state chiefs who have taken up the mantle and owned that they have this leadership moment, and others who are maybe more political and are afraid to do hard things. So, the work that you're doing to try to support, encourage, prod states towards action, that's good. We need that.
Yeah. Norm, your thoughts on the shift to states?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into very political territory. I would be very happy if states took the lead because the alternative is the local LEAs, the local school boards. And traveling around, I am beginning to wonder whether the local, I'm all for democracy. The more democracy, the better, except the way I see democracy playing out at the local school boards, it's people who don't have their kids in school or have very specialty interests with their kids are essentially controlling school boards and making the work of the superintendents' lives miserable. And so the average urban superintendent stays in the job for barely enough time to pick the materials and hire the teachers, and not to build any kind of long-term strategic plan. So if the states can take leadership and drive us toward the implementation of science of reading and high-quality instructional materials, keep assessments, don't dumb down the standards, that would be that would be fantastic set of guardrails. Otherwise, I'm quite worried.
Yeah. John, you share Norm's view on the local school districts?
Look, I think unfortunately, there was a period when we were making a bet on mayoral control around the country. That bet has not uniformly paid off. So we end up back at school boards because we have not figured out a better alternative. We do have some functional school boards, but in order to achieve that, you got to have good folks who run. People have to invest in their campaigns, and people have to show up and vote in these elections. And sadly, what's happening in many high needs districts, there are many suburban school districts whose boards are fine, but in many high needs districts, there are very low participation elections. And you get, unfortunately, folks running who are in it more for their political ambition or even greed and corruption. So that's very worrisome. There are some reforms that I think would make a difference, like having school board elections when there are regular elections so that more people participate in the process. But it's so ingrained in American culture. We have 13,000 school districts. It's hard to imagine a scenario where that changes much.
Yeah. Let's go back to teacher prep, which is obviously something we've all been engaged with, Norman most of all, and I some years back. We've gotten tired of complaining. I have, at least after so many years. Norm, do you see movement there? I mean, there are groups like Deans for Impact. There's the prodding from NCTQ. There's some examples. We've been working with Arizona State, working on new team leadership programs. Are you a little bit more optimistic than you would have been 10 years ago about that sector?
I think we need to open up the sluice gates for more innovation, and the way we're gonna do that is to deregulate. I think that the rules on certification are so constraining that it contributes to the issues that we were talking about before around just getting people into the pipeline. And I think that sort of relying on people to major in education as undergraduates is not the way to build the teaching force of the future. And so I'm for anything to just start to build the pool. And I fear that the certification rules are really too off-putting. I visited a school recently, a high school that had a great program and no physics teacher. And I think people who can teach that particular content are not necessarily going to go and participate in the certification programs as laid out by the government. And I think we probably need to think about role definition of teachers differently, and that we need people who are going to be teaching the students and people who are going to be teaching the content. Ideally, you have one person doing both, but I think we need some expertise on teaching really complex content, and we need to make the job more feasible for a whole lot of other people who are really great with kids and can point them in the right direction toward really positive experiences. We probably also have to admit that coming out of COVID, everything is not going to return back just to be in person. You've got to have a combination of really high quality belonging experiences inside of school, along with high quality lessons that can be taught by great folks online.
So, John, as you know, in the Far East, this differentiation of professionalism has been the rule for a long time, right? You have the curriculum expert, the data expert, the content expert, the mentor, but they don't have the challenges you spoke of earlier necessarily of this enormous need to get more minority candidates into teaching. When you cross-reference all of that with what Norm is speaking about, where does it leave us in thinking nationally about the future of teacher preparation?
I think we have to be more creative on a couple levels. One is there are a lot of folks who work in schools, paraprofessionals, folks who work in after school and summer programs, behavioral specialists. We've created a lot of roles where people are paid less than teachers. Those roles are generally filled by a higher percentage of people of color, a higher percentage of bilingual folks, a higher percentage of folks from the community that's served by the school. We ought to be thinking creatively about how to get those people trained up and certified as teachers. We could have programs that honor the experience that they bring as paras or that they've gained through their after school or summer experience. We could have the faculty members of the teacher prep institutions working with the student teachers in their schools.
As an idea.
Rather than making them come to the campus, right? So we make it more viable for someone who's also juggling family and other responsibilities. We could build residency programs, as you and I tried to work on when we were working together in New York, that allow people to work in roles in a school building where they are apprenticing essentially while they're getting their degree. We could have new providers enter the space. I'm on the board of the Museum of Natural History. We worked together to make it possible for the Museum of Natural History in New York City to train earth science teachers. It's amazing what the teachers are able to do leveraging the resources of the museum. Why couldn't more museums, aquariums, be in the business of preparing teachers in STEM fields? And to Norman's point, we need to get more creative about people who are employed in the workforce, doing the jobs we want to train young people for, and creating ways for them to spend 3/4 of their time as coders and 1/4 of their time working in a school preparing the next generation of coders. That's a deal that people who are working at Google would be interested in. They're probably not going to leave their job to be a full-time computer science teacher, but maybe we could find a way to get that part of their time.
No, I endorse strongly what both of you have said. I have the scars of trying to change this, right? Most recently, and I'll say it because it's public, in Nebraska, I made a set of recommendations around residency, around innovation. And of course, the schools of education went to war. And it's extraordinary that a monopoly can lose 30% of its population, its student population, and still have so much power. One of the reasons is politics, of course, and the representatives who are in those districts where those universities with those ed schools, right, that bring in the tuition dollars. We saw this in New York, right, with SUNY. But I think that it's as much a political problem as anything else. The ideas are there. And we absolutely could be far more innovative in our thinking about matching different skill sets to teaching. But we really do face still an enormous blockage, right, from the status quo defenders in the schools of education. It's really tough to move that politics. And I'm surprised. I would have thought that they would have weakened considerably. More than they have, at least from where I sit. I don't know, Norm, if you see a strategy moving forward to get towards the kind of innovations you and John are talking about, that what, does it go around the schools of education? It has to then go to the state legislatures, presumably.
I don't have a political agenda. I do think one of the things that I have seen great progress at Relay of implementing residency programs and training paraprofessionals, and a high incidence of teachers of color coming into the profession. And so I remain optimistic that just as we've ended up with a consensus around science of reading, we're going to end up with a consensus of the ways in which we prepare people for the profession. But I can't really speak to the political agenda there. You guys would know that better than I would.
John, be more optimistic than me, John.
I'd like to think that, you were able at Hunter, within the CUNY system, to be innovative as a dean and saw that as a way to strengthen the institution.
Right.
And I'd like to think that as people see the enrollment declines, which have been accelerated,
Yes.
COVID, that folks will say, this is a time to be entrepreneurial, to rethink, to think differently about how we partner, who we partner with, to get creative about being more responsive to the students. So I'd like to think there are more David Steiners out in the world who could be leading teacher ed institutions, because that is where the bulk of teachers are trained. I mean, I'm glad that we've created these innovative pathways, but at the end of the day, we've got to move. If we want to move the system, we have to move those institutions towards a more entrepreneurial future.
Yeah, yeah. There's an interesting question in the chat, which is sort of relevant to this, which is, just as we've been talking about incentivizing schools of education or just training of teachers more generally, what is going to move districts? We've talked about superintendents and what they face, right, in the current atmosphere, culturally, politically, but they do tend to be small c conservative, right? When it comes to innovation, they don't want to embrace it largely. And there's a real question of, the states can push, as we spoke earlier, but the districts have to follow, right? And the districts have to believe in it. One of the things that worries me very much, data out of Tom Kane's research at Harvard and what we've done at Hopkins, we have a lot of districts with really great curriculum, and Norman's been very important in supporting Zern in mathematics, for example, and the teachers won't use it, right? And the districts won't require the teachers to use it. The teachers are convinced their kids can't manage it, particularly if those kids are of color, by the way. They're just convinced that they're being ethical in dumbing down the material and passing those children on. So there's a very deep sort of skepticism about rigor out there in the district schools. And I for one, am still struggling with how to think about that creatively. John, you have some thoughts on that?
The challenge you describe is very real. I think the feedback loops are not great, right?
Yeah,
and so we don't have a good way to say to schools, if you try this innovation, we're going to invest in it. We're going to measure periodically how it's going. We're going to course correct over time. And we're going to give you opportunities to reflect and learn and build on that innovation.
Yeah.
And, I think some states, we tried in New York, Delaware did some things using Race to the Top funds early in the Obama administration to try to create better feedback loops. Unfortunately, a lot of that didn't stick after the money went away. But I think we've got to say to people, here's the resources. And this was the missed opportunity in the American Rescue Plan. Here's the resources, but we're going to build these feedback loops so that if you say you're doing Zern, we're gonna look and see, how are the kids doing? How much are you using it? Where are the struggles? What are the victories? And then build hopefully a positive cycle of improvement.
Right. I want to just alert our viewers that if they have questions, they're welcome to put them in the chat, since we only have now 10 minutes left. Norman, any thoughts from you on this issue?
You can't just drop the curriculum on teachers and expect them to implement it without making the case for it, providing the training, and I think in the instances where that is done, so in the instance of Zern, I've seen very good adoption across the board, and teachers really liking the materials and appreciating the training and recognizing the transparency of the data. And we're seeing just great impact across entire states with that. And so there's no reason why other programs can't do that as well.
But that's a really important point. The data that Tom Kane found across the country was that in the instance of a new math curriculum, on average, teachers got a day and a breakfast. I'm paraphrasing the breakfast comment. on average, a teacher will have been teaching for 13 years in the United States. You're not going to change 13 years of professional practice because of a day, right, of PD, much of which will be taken up with process and the rest of it. It is crucial, and we know this from unpublished research out of Louisiana, that not only the upfront PD is substantive, but that it continue, right, and that it be curriculum specific. And one of the most important findings is that principals need to add curriculum specific rubrics, right, to their observations so that the teachers know that they're expected to teach the actual content, right, of the curriculum. This has been tough. Charlotte Danielson has said for years that she would give us curriculum specific rubrics. It hasn't happened. They exist, but they're not widely used yet. So it can be done. And as you rightly say, Norman, with there are exciting examples of it being done at national scale. The fidelity of implementation of these really good tools is still very low. And that, I think, is a challenge.
Let me just add that, another example of what Norman is describing, Expeditionary Learning has done studies of implementation of the Expeditionary Learning curriculum with and without the sort of Cadillac supports of regular coaching and regular professional development for teachers. And they found a meaningful difference when teachers get the high quality support. And so we've got to see those investments as tied together.
There's a question in the chat that's been brought to my attention about what we've learned from the pandemic, right? We've talked a lot about the negative impact. Have we learned anything important from a positive point of view in terms of related to equity issues in education? John, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, two things. One sad and one happy. The sad thing is, I think, we saw, and I lived this as a parent. I had a freshman and a senior in high school during the year that schools were essentially virtual all year. I think we saw very starkly that school is about more than just the academics. It's a set of relationships. It's a community. For some kids, it's arts or athletics or the debate team that gets them excited to be in school. And if we reduce school to worksheets and Zoom screens where everybody's camera is off but the teacher, that is not a way to have kids feel happy, fulfilled, and committed to their studies. And so I think we've learned something about school as community and the importance of belonging and connection. So that's the sadder thing. The happier thing is we should never again in this country say to a young person, you can't take that class because it's not offered in this building. We learned it is possible to make courses available in high quality ways through online and blended learning. If you want to take Japanese that's not offered in your school, we should make that possible. If you want to take AP Physics not offered in your school building, we should make that possible. If we don't, shame on us.
And just sort of adding to that, I think people learned how to teach effectively on Zoom online. Not everybody did it, but there is now a taxonomy of active learning science on in an online setting. And so not only is it true that you should be able to take anything anywhere in the world, but it should be held to a very high standard. And there's no reason why people can't go and deliver it. In some ways, this is gonna add to the toolbox, but that is all built on the foundation that school is a place where kids come to belong and to have experiences of relationships with their peers and with adults and in their community.
No, and I would add that I was very surprised, I shouldn't have been, to learn that the number of children being homeschooled is now equal to the number in private schools and greater than the number in charter schools. And I do think that much of what we've said is innovate or die, right? That really we are talking about a pressure that the many parents have voted with their feet and pulled their kids out of public schools. We need to see an energizing of the public school sector as a whole, in order to create the quality around the very crucial community issues that you spoke of, John, because I couldn't say more than you did about that. It is crucial, and having kids just sitting alone at home will create untold pathologies, right? Social, psychological, and otherwise. But I do think we have to be careful, right? That there for the first time, there are intelligent people who are asking questions about the future of public schools in this country. They may be exaggerating, they may be overreacting, but it's not a really strong moment for this institution.
David, the K-12 private school enrollment went from what to what, pre-pandemic to post-pandemic?
Very little rise. We're talking about kids who are homeschooled rather than private school.
Homeschooled. And did you know what those numbers are? Do you know what the actual numbers are?
It's about 7%. 7 to 9% was the rise.
So you're saying 4.5 million
Right.
kids nationally. That's
right. I need to check the numbers. I don't want to quote it wrongly, but the numbers I was given last week from fairly good sources were that basically, if you take the private school population, the homeschool population is essentially now equivalent to it. That may be just right, maybe slightly off, but it is clearly the only sector that really rose in private education was some of the Catholic schools, not all of them. There were some groups of Catholic schools that did see increased enrollment during COVID. Well, we are close to the end of our hour. John, a last thought?
Just to build on your point, I think it's not only is it innovate or die around the sector, but I think the stakes for democracy are very high, because to my mind, public education is foundational to a healthy democracy. And so that jeopardy is really for all of us and for the well-being of the country.
Yes. Norm, a last thought?
We are making a lot of progress in fighting climate change, and the sort of the kind of the inspiration move on the environment is really high right now, and we need to recapture that in public education. Even if we're to believe your numbers on homeschool and private school enrollment, we still have a higher percentage of kids going to public schools than just about any other country in the world, and we have got to use our public schools to go advance not only our democracy, but the skills and the development of all of our young people so that they can have the ultimate opportunities in life.
Amen to both of what you just said. My mother was an immigrant from Lithuania, went to the public school. It was the world for her, as I know it was for you, John. And I think that this has been one of the glories of the American experiment. And we put it in peril at our peril and at the peril of our future. Well, thank you, everybody. And that includes Michael for bringing us together. John, Norm, it's always a pleasure and a privilege to share some time with you. It's both energizing and depressing in about equal measure, which is appropriate, I suspect. But I want to thank our audience and thank Schools That Can for putting this together. And thank you all for your time.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Sure.